Hello, and welcome to The Queer Gaze, where we dissect queer media from every country, complete with nuanced discussion of representation and issues.
This season, we've organised our titles by theme, and we'll be comparing popular, well-known films with lesser-known titles.
You can support The Queer Gaze and get extra content as well as early access over on Patreon at patreon.com/thequeergaze.
And you can follow us on social media at The Queer Gaze. Hello, Joe.
Hello, Conrad. I'm very excited because we're talking about a Canadian film for the lesser-known title of this double bill on rural homophobia and repression.
Yes. And this one is a little bit of a genre switch for us. So It is Tom at the Farm, or more correctly, Tom à la Ferme, by Enfant Terrible of Canada, Xavier Dolan, whose films I've very much enjoyed. I haven't seen many of them, but the ones I have seen, I've enjoyed a great deal. And it's based on the play of the same name by Michel-Marc Bouchard, who co-wrote the screenplay with Dolan. And it was screened in the Venice Film Festival and TIFF in 2013 and won some prizes too. So it was very, very well thought of. But unlike the other titles in I think it's 4 films we've done of rural repression so far, this one is a thriller.
It is indeed. And it's interesting because I was wondering how it was going to affect our conversation, because the other films have been romantic and we've been able to talk about, swooning and how the music and the imagery contributes to that. And one of the things that really struck me upon watching this was, we can still have all of those conversations, but they're just reframed through a very different lens here, where it's like, I'm turned on, but I'm not swooning.
Yes, I think so, yes. And particularly people who've listened to this and anything else I've been on know that I always talk about the score far too much. And whereas before we've been talking, particularly in the last 2 films, about the absence of score, except for one Paddy moment during a moment of realization of the beauty of nature, the score on this one is bouncing around all over this soundtrack. Courtesy of Gabriel Yared, who is doing his best agitato, tremolo, nervous string energy, filling it with dread and terror from the get-go. And it's very much in the vein of another queer Tom that he had scored not too long before this, Tom Ripley and the Talented Mr. Ripley. So I'm just lapping it up. I actually own the score on CD from Quartet Records.
Oh, wow.
If anybody wants to track that one down. It's gorgeous.
Yeah, it is quite memorable. I mean, in terms of thriller genre-esque titles, this is definitely hitting all of the relevant plot beats, but it's not surprising at all to see that people compare this to something like a Hitchcock title, or people saying, the score gives you a bit of Bernard Herrmann-esque levels to it. But obviously, this is all very by design.
Very much so, and strangely not from a director that had any familiarity with Hitchcock, which is shocking to discover. I saw an interview with Xavier today where he said he'd seen one Hitchcock movie when he filmed Tom at the Farm. It was Vertigo, which is probably relevant to our discussion,
right?
In terms of recreating somebody who's died.
Yep.
But visually, I don't think he's doing Hitchcock. I don't think he's influenced by Hitchcock in any conscious way. And certainly he couldn't have been, because he hadn't seen any. So the setup for this, speaking of someone who has died, we have a character who is going to the farm, the hometown of their partner who has died at the very young age of 25. And he's going home for the funeral of his dead partner, to a family that is not expecting him.
Nope.
And did not know that he is queer, or at least some of them don't know that he's queer.
We're going to talk about that, because what people do and do not know, and then what they say, I think is of prime importance to this narrative.
It is, yeah, you're absolutely right. Yeah. But it reminded me of a film that we saw at TIFF, Went Up the Hill, which was
Yes.
another case of queer character returning home to
Hmm.
funeral for a family member when they were not expected. So it's interesting to see that set up again. But here, the whole thing is dominated by the hyper masculine and
Mm.
threatening presence of the dead partner's brother,
Yep.
Francis, played by Pierre-Yves Cardinal, who is just one great big slab and edifice of alpha male terror in this movie.
Truly, he cuts a very imposing figure, and it's deeply ironic because listeners, uh, Conrad and I may have messaged each other within the space of about 5 minutes. Like we were both clearly on the same wavelength that Tom just comes off looking so small and frail and vulnerable. Like basically, Francis is an intimidating mountain of a man, or so it would appear on screen. And then you look up and you realize, oh, Xavier Dolan is 5'6", so nearly anyone would tower over him. But the film does get some great mileage out of it.
It does, yeah. And one thing I particularly love, although the shots are not reminiscent of Hitchcock, I do love the visual design of this movie. I do think it's
Hmm.
very different from Xavier's sentimental family dramas that had
Yes.
won awards prior to this, because he is choosing very particularly what he reveals and what he doesn't reveal.
Hmm.
And the first shot of Francis, I think, is very telling. He
Yeah.
just strides up to Tom sitting at the family dining table. You do not see his head, it is not in the frame. You are
Hmm.
introduced to Francis as a torso that stands threateningly behind Tom over the
Wow.
top of him. Yeah.
Conrad, that's the first time we see him clearly, but you're overlooking the fact that our actual introduction to Francis is when he jumps into bed with Tom in the middle of the night to
Yes,
essentially
true.
either throttle him and or climb on top of him.
And that is pretty much the energy that we have for the
The
entire
entire film.
movie.
Yeah.
Yeah. He is threatening Tom, do not reveal the sexuality of my dead brother to my mother, say
Hmm.
some pretty words, and get out of
Get
our
out.
lives.
Until
Yes.
all of a sudden it's like, I kind of like having you around because you're really good with the livestock and you make my mother laugh. And it's so lonely being me with my super aggro, mentally disturbed behavior. And how come I can't land a woman? And there's an actual dance sequence in this film if you haven't seen it. But so
Mm.
much of the movie feels like a dance between these characters of Tom trying not to set Francis off, but then also maybe playing into the fantasy because there's a pretty telling moment where Tom will play act a phone call that he had with his partner's imaginary girlfriend. This is the lie we have told mother, but he's
Mm.
obviously speaking on behalf of himself in coded language. And he talks about how he's worthless and he's not a good person. And you really get the impression part of the reason Tom ends up getting sucked into this psychosexual drama on the farm is because he doesn't like himself. And he thinks, well, maybe I could stay here and just play farm wife to this psycho because it's better than going back to my shit job in the big city and not loving myself.
Yes. And I did wonder when I was watching that scene this time whether Francis is moved by it. He appears to
Hmm.
be.
It's so much is left unsaid in this movie, which I truly love. It's one of my favorite things about the film is how
Mm.
much is left to the viewer to interpret. Like how much do people know? What are they actually saying? How much do they understand? And so on. And a lot of it is really just left up to us to infer. And I really like how we are treated as intelligent audiences who get to make up our own minds about what is really going on.
Yeah. Well, speaking of people trying to recreate the dead in order to
Hmm.
keep them alive, very
Right.
much in the spirit of Vertigo, where we
Right.
dress up a woman who posed as a woman who was already dead, which is still a mind fuck even now.
Wrap your head around that.
Yeah. We have that again here, and in the spirit of all of our rural repressed homophobic movies that we've been looking at,
Hmm.
there's an awful lot of sniffing, there's an awful lot of wearing dead people's clothes.
Yep.
And there are people acting as surrogates for each other all
Hmm.
over the place on this farm. The mother is enjoying having two boys in the house, sleeping in the same room nonetheless. I
Yep.
notice that the beds creep closer together as the movie progresses too.
Yes, yes. I never saw that before because, yeah, very early in the film, when Tom sort of enters the house, he takes a look around and there's no dialogue to help guide you because he's by himself. So he looks and he peeks in, and you see two single beds, but they're both pushed against opposite sides of the wall. And by the end of the film, it's basically a marriage bed where the furniture has been completely rearranged. So the beds are now side by side.
They are. Yes. And yeah, so, and there's lots of comments about cologne and when you
Hmm.
wear cologne and when you don't wear cologne, and lots of Tom saying to Francis, you smell like your brother,
Hmm.
your voice sounds so much like him. So you feel
Yeah.
as though part of Tom's Stockholm syndrome is just that being around Francis gives him something of the man that he lost, and he's
Yes.
willing to put up with the abuse that he's getting, which is borderline homicidal. I mean, it is
Oh,
really threatening. There
I
is
mean,
nothing sort of gentle or slightly abusive about this. He is teetering on the edge of death several times.
yes. And as the film progresses, we learn the extent to which Francis is capable of violence in,
Mm.
I think, one of the most restrained moments in a film that is pretty careful about how much it does show us and when. And I think the reveal of Francis's damage to, like, the dead brother had a lover as a teenager, and Francis almost ripped this guy's face open.
Yeah. It's very delicately handled. You don't get a clear shot of it
Mm-mm.
particularly, but the way that it's described is pretty horrifying.
Horrifying.
Yeah. And it mirrors a moment earlier on in the film where, again, not influenced by Hitchcock because he hadn't seen it, but there is a chase through a cornfield,
Yes,
and corn apparently is razor sharp in October.
it is. Yes.
Is it? Okay. So
Mhm.
the side of Tom's mouth is cut, and I don't know, that plus the hair, it
Yep.
gives me Heath Ledger Joker vibes, oddly enough.
A little bit. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
we're dealing with characters who are teetering on the brink of sanity or insanity. But yeah, I mean, let's maybe talk about some of the visual aesthetics of the film because this this is a film that is trading in very different looks compared to all of the other films that we've talked about most recently. Like, those have always been sort of softer focus, spring, summer settings, beautiful outdoor nature. And here, everything about this farm, everything about nature is now coded as threatening.
Yeah. It's all death,
Yeah.
decline. It's the beginning of God's own country
Yes.
with none of the coming of spring. This is just
No.
plunging into winter, and it's getting more worse and unremittingly bleak
Hmm.
with death all around. I think it's no coincidence that the calf that Francis and Tom birth together is found dead
Dead.
at some point. Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a stillborn relationship, if there ever was one. Nothing's good is going to come of this particular
Hmm.
marriage. Yeah, it's very bleak.
Well, and it's in large part because, as much, I mean, we're going to talk about, there's no actual sex, but there's a lot of sexualized encounters, and it's always accompanied by violence in this movie. But one of the things that I found really interesting is how, even though so much of it is either homoerotic or queer coded, you get the impression as the film progresses that Francis never actually looks at Tom that way. Like, what he is looking for is a wife to help run this farm. And he is willing to convince himself that Tom can fit that bill, which is interesting, right? Because we've talked about Xavier Dolan's hair in this. It's very stringy and mop like, but it's bleached the same color as the corn, the dead corn. But
Mm.
you know, you could read it as a slightly effeminate look. And there is this moment, you mentioned the cologne. When we're talking about Francis wearing cologne, it is cologne. But when he accuses Tom of wearing his dead brother's cologne, he calls it perfume.
Yeah, he does. And he also names the calf bitch ass, apparently. Yes. In reference to Tom's ass, which apparently is
Mm-hmm.
feminine as well, which he knows because he just bursts in on him in the shower at one
Yes.
point early on, in which you get a flash cut of Francis as a featureless monster, which
Yes.
is quite
Is it
disturbing.
Francis or is it the dead brother?
Or is it both? Are their
Maybe.
identities becoming merged? Because the dead
Yes.
brother is Guy, isn't it? Guillaume.
Yes. Although, if you want to do just the straight English translation, it's Guy. He's every man. Like he's a stand in for any generic man.
Yes, and we never see him, not even in
No.
flashback. There is an out of focus portrait in the funeral scene
Yes.
that you do not see very clearly.
Yeah. And we see him on the periphery of the flashback of the karaoke, but it's mostly about Tom singing with him.
Yes, it is. So there is this sort of unreachable quality of Guy and
Hmm.
the reality of Francis as the
Yes.
replacement, which, yeah, is really disturbing. I find the whole film very disturbing.
Oh, which I love. I mean,
Mm.
makes me sound psychotic myself, but yeah, every time I revisit this film, this is the third time I've watched this movie, and each time I find it even more perfectly calibrated. It's so well executed. It has such a measured control of tone and atmosphere. Like the violence is sparing, but it hits so fucking hard, and you're afraid for Tom the entire
Mm.
movie. But I also say this as somebody who is really upset by narratives where characters get trapped in an impossible situation with a lot of implied violence or risk of implied violence. And I'm thinking of things like Eden Lake, where you go on a camping trip, and then all of a sudden you're confronted by people who just want to kill you. And I find these kinds of narratives very upsetting. So I would put this in the same vein as something like, yeah, Eden Lake, or maybe Calvaire, which is part of the new French extremity movement, but just people getting trapped in impossible situations, and you're like, they're probably just going to die.
Yeah. What gives you hope in this one is that it's, as you said, the violence hits hard, but it's never extreme. It's never
Mm-mm.
torture porn. And
No.
also, it's softened by the fact that Tom is, well, there is a Stockholm syndrome, there is a domestic
Yes.
violence aspect to it, but also
Yes.
there is a sense that there is something here that he is attracted to and that he needs,
Yes.
particularly in the scene where Francis throttles him.
Well, okay, so do you know about the deleted scene from this film?
I do not. All I have on my copy of the movie is a trailer, unfortunately.
Yes. Yeah. This is a film that is overdue for some kind of platinum boutique release. Like, it's not even in
Mm.
4K. It's impossible to find streaming. And when it does pop up, it's often incredibly expensive to buy. So I hate it. I wish that this film could be seen by more people. But yeah, okay, so it's a scene that was apparently shot, and then Dolan himself removed it in the edit. So it's not available to be seen anywhere. But in this one moment, basically, when Tom says, I'm going to tell, I'm going to leave, and things seem at their most dire, Francis throttles him up against the barn. And we're very clearly seeing most of the action from about the waist up, but there's implied movement. And what was originally in the cut is that while Francis is throttling him, like basically strangling him about the neck, the other hand is jerking Tom off.
Right. Okay. See, I detected an aspect of that still
I think it's
being
still there.
there.
You can still infer it, but Dolan took it out because he felt that it was too much, apparently, which I disagree with.
Yeah, but I mean, one of the things that I loved when I was watching this film is that I really did not know where it was going to go. And
No.
I was genuinely terrified and genuinely shocked at each development.
Mm.
So that would have shocked, horrified, and delighted me in equal measure if he had jerked him off.
The trifecta, the thing that we're
Yeah,
actually searching for, right?
yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, it doesn't surprise me because Tom does seem to be enjoying the throttling just a little bit too
Yeah.
much.
Yeah. And part of it is that Stockholm Syndrome role playing. I will go along with this in part because I don't want to get murdered, but also because I am maybe secretly getting turned on. Like, there's a really memorable episode of 6 Feet Under with David, the gay brother from the funeral parlor family. He picks up a hitchhiker. And he has this conversation where it seems like this man could injure him if he is revealed to be queer, or something really dangerous is going to happen. But there is a kind of flashback moment where you get insight into David's mind where he imagines having sex with this man. And it's clear that there's a fatalistic turn on. And I'm not going to lie, I think in a lot of queer media, we have that, right? Like, there's a danger in hookup culture. That's why you see a bunch of movies and shorts that deal with people who, make a date on Grindr and then it goes very badly. So this idea of the intermingling of sexual thrill with the possibility of death or injury is so pertinent to the queer community.
Yeah, and so many of their encounters are coded that way.
Yes.
Like Francis grabbing Tom and pushing him into the stall of a toilet at the funeral.
I mean, a toilet.
Yes, exactly. Cottaging ahoy, and then demands that he be silent in his quivering, crouched, cowering position while they wait for somebody to finish their business and leave.
Yeah.
Yeah. So much of it is coded with that. And then we have a literal tango.
Yes. Yeah. Which ironically is the least dangerous, the closest thing that we get to actual romance. But during the whole interaction, Francis is talking about how he wishes that his mom would just die so that he can be free of having to take care of her before she becomes either senile or mentally ill, or that he wishes he could leave the farm. It's actually the most character development we get for Francis in this moment where two men are dancing the tango. And also we learn that he used to do it with his dead brother. So there's this suggestion of like incest or like a thwarted romance between the brothers, which just adds to, okay, who is Tom actually replacing and why?
Yeah. What on earth is he getting into in this family? And of course, the tango itself has always been a dangerous dance of seduction that, when it was introduced in Europe, was scandalous because of the close body hold throughout.
Oh, no.
And so, yeah, I remember studying this because of Legend. I wrote an essay on Legend at university, and the waltz, which, okay, not a tango, but the waltz also scandalous because of the close hold throughout, and that being used as the devil seducing Lily to the dark side.
Oh,
So,
wow.
yeah. But you mentioned the mother there. I think it's very useful to have a conversation about Agatha, or Agatha, I guess. What does she know? What is she aware? I think you were right to raise a question about that right at the beginning, because
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to challenge you right off the top, but it's one of those things where you go into it thinking, oh, okay, this is all for her benefit. We need to lie to protect her because she's got this image of the boy in her mind. And then you're just like, oh no, everyone is lying to themselves.
Yeah. They come very, very close to challenging it all at one point. And that is probably the only really extreme close-up we get, is Agatha saying, why is she not upset? Talking about Sarah, the proxy girlfriend that turns up at one point. She questions everything, and the whole house of cards comes dangerously close to teetering over. But then she retreats to safety and retreats to the fiction that she's telling herself. So you're right. She is not as naive as she appears.
Yeah. And there's this interesting moment too, right? Because when Sarah arrives, it becomes an extra layer to the ruse where, okay, we can continue to lie to ourselves because now here's the physical embodiment of the absent girlfriend. So out comes a shoebox full of letters and mementos and different things, but we've never read the letters that the dead brother wrote. So what is in the letters and have we really truly not opened them? Because part of me, the way that the interaction or the reveal of this is framed suggests to me that these would have been things like coming out letters or love letters or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. My question to you is, who puts the box with the keepsakes by Tom's bed before he makes his final attempt at fleeing the farm?
Hmm. Yeah, because we don't see Agath again, right?
No. So who puts them there?
I think it's her, and then she leaves the house because it's almost like a peace offering or a an acknowledgement. I know that this has been a farce, but then she can't stay to unpack the repercussions.
No. No, I think you're right. I tried to imagine why Francis might do it, but I couldn't come up with a reason why he would do it. I mean, he does vacillate as abusers do between being incredibly intimidating, just a
Hmm.
real toxic force of nature,
Yeah.
to very lonely, very charming, very desperate, very
Hmm.
needy, quite pathetic almost,
Yeah.
and apologetic, and then back again to a
Yeah.
monster. So it's very disarming.
It is. And it's such a captivating performance. Like, I'm actually not familiar
Mm.
with any of these actors except for, I know Evelyn Brochu. She was in Orphan Black, the TV show. She's the lesbian lover of the
Oh, yeah.
scientist Cosima doppelganger. And then I know that Lise Roy, who plays Agath, I believe that she's like a well respected French actress. But in Canada, we have a kind of like, it's almost like a two-party system where if you're famous in Quebec, that probably means the rest of Canada doesn't know you because they have their whole separate SAR system just for themselves. It's linguistic, it's part of the national identity and their separatist efforts and so on. So it's a bit complicated to unpack here. But I was not familiar with Pierre-Yves Cardinal, and I am Tom when I watch this movie because I
Mm.
find him incredibly sexy and dangerous all at the same time.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm completely with you on that one. And it's the thing that I find really fascinating is that this film continues right to the very end,
Mm-hmm.
beyond the credits,
Yep.
stay throughout the credits, not
Mm-hmm.
only for Rufus Wainwright's song Going to a Town, which I had never heard before I saw this movie, and which I
It's
completely fell in
perfection.
love with. It
Yep.
is, yeah.
Rufus is so great too.
Yeah, he's a genius, and I've watched many YouTube videos of him playing this live, and the man is phenomenally talented.
Mm-hmm.
But you get to the end, and spoilers here: Tom does leave the farm. He, in a very
Yep.
exciting chase sequence, he manages to escape, stealing Francis's truck in the process.
Yep.
And the very last shot is him sitting at an intersection with the lights changing from red to green. And you know what? I have a terrible feeling he's going to go back.
Yep. Because we've already seen him try to make a breakaway initially between the service and then, well, there's no reception because clearly the family has a strained relationship with the other people who live nearby because they're
Mm,
psychos.
yes.
But we saw Tom debate whether to just leave his luggage behind, and then he ultimately decides, no, I'll go back. And then from there, he's more or less imprisoned by Francis. But yeah, I mean, I love the open endedness of this, but I think if you've been paying attention throughout the rest of the film, it does seem pretty obvious to me that he will probably go back. And whether that means that he dies or he becomes Francis's wife, these are both not great fates. But Tom is a character who hates himself and probably feels like he deserves whatever he gets.
Yeah. Which is tragic, and it's worrying because it feels like a dark twist on the rom-com finale where you, as we saw in our previous movie in this series, you race to get your man at the end. This is
Hmm.
the reverse of that. Is he going to race back to this incredibly toxic relationship?
Yeah,
So yeah, we're through the looking glass with
truly.
the Hitchcockian Bernard Herrmann strings playing on it.
Yeah, yeah.
Love it.
I think that that's maybe a good point to wrap up our main feed discussion, and maybe we can
Mhm.
unpack some of this in greater detail over on Patreon.
Indeed, yeah. See you there.